Hello, everyone, and welcome to you all. This is a special True North update for you, coming to you from the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, the preeminent gathering of conservatives in this great nation of Canada. We are out in full force. The True North team is here. We've got more of our colleagues than I can count, some of whom I haven't seen in quite a while, but we picked a couple of them to have a fantastic discussion about the state of the world, the state of the country, and what True North is doing. I'm joined by Rupa Subramanya and Anthony Furey, my two favorite colleagues, equally matched with everyone else, just so that no one else is feeling left out here. But thanks for coming. What are you guys thinking so far?
Sounds like we're going to solve all the problems there.
We are, yeah.
Big tee up there. Great expectations.
Yeah, set the high expectations. We have to clear the bar. Let's just talk about Ottawa for starters, because Rupa, you and I met a number of times here just over a year ago for the Freedom Convoy. The conservative movement has changed a lot since then. We've got Pierre as leader who's speaking today. We've got a bunch of different dynamics. Danielle Smith is premier, and both of those people are here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's exciting to be here, and I think this is the second conference since the pandemic, and I was here last year, and it was just as exciting, and it's great to be back here. I'm really thrilled about the conference agenda itself has been very informative. There was a very interesting panel on Bill C-11 yesterday, which I attended, and Bill C-18, of course. And these are important issues, which deserve the attention that they're getting, because it's not just a question of government overreach anymore. There's something really big happening here, and I'm so glad that we're gathered here to discuss these issues here in Ottawa.
Obviously, there's a bit of a middle-class theme going on in what Stephen Harper was talking about, what some of the panels are about. Is that the money issue right now? Is that the big issue that everyone needs to be addressing if you want to talk about the conservative movement?
Well, sure, and that's a good point, Andrew. But Rupa, I think, put it really well in saying there's something big happening here, because there's a sort of amorphousness to what's going on, I think, in politics at all levels of government right now, where the things that seem to ail us are things that persons who are center-right positioned are almost in the best place to solve them. A lot of the concerns that people have right now, I think, are about the fact that people who are not partisan, regular folks, swing voters, they're kind of calling out for the pendulum to just kind of realign itself a bit. We just went a little bit too far with a number of things. And I think regular folks are open to that, aware of that, and respond to that message. I think that's the opportunity for people who are more conservative-minded. I mean, it's really about the fact that the center is coming home to you, and you want to welcome the center, and you want to have those constructive conversations with them, because that's maybe where the nation's at right now.
Yeah, I would just jump in to say that I spoke to a number of people yesterday, and these are people who voted for the Liberals in 2015. And they were here at this conference.
I met two women that voted for the Liberals in 2019. So, this was the Trudeau blackface election. They voted for Justin Trudeau and now have just done a complete flip on that. So people do change their perspective on these.
I've run into NDP persons or former NDP persons here at this conference in previous years. So just like chatting with people, and we saw over the past few years with COVID perspectives, I mean, there are a lot of interesting alliances and dynamics, and just reassessing, our relationship with the state there.
Let's talk about the conservative identity, which I think is one of the big issues that the conservative movement, the Conservative Party, needs to address. You've had successive leaders, Stephen Harper, Rona Ambrose, Andrew Scheer, Candice Bergen, Aaron O'Toole, or we flip those around, and now we have
You're
Pierre,
so respectful of
Poilievre.
The interim leaders. That was such a kind talent.
They're part of it. And I mean, Rona in particular, she was the leader for about a year and a half because of how long that leadership race was. And each of them has tried to put their own stamp on the party. And I guess the question is, do you think Pierre Poilievre is trying to do something new with the Conservative Party, or do you think he's trying to bring it back to that Harper approach?
Yeah, I think that he's not afraid to call it as he sees it. He's an unapologetic conservative. And those were my initial impressions of Pierre Poilievre. Of course, I mean, he's still now just the leader of the Conservative Party. That's still a long way to go, and he's got to be really careful with some of the issues that people want him to tackle. But I think, as far as I'm concerned, I think he has his own brand. He's not afraid to call out the CBC. or mainstream media for that matter. And I think he's definitely putting his stamp on the Conservative Party.
What's your thought on that, Anthony? Are we seeing a rebirth of a new Conservative Party, or are we seeing a return to the last version of the party, or the last iteration that was successful?
Both. Going back to the roots, but also there are younger people who have no real memory of that. Maybe weren't even alive back then when we're talking about the formation of the current incarnation of the Conservative Party 20 years ago or so. But they're really being inspired by all of this. And I think what Pierre's doing, and this isn't to devalue his own work. I know he's writing his own speeches. He's coming up with all this by himself. But at the same time, they said Mozart just went and plucked the songs out of the air. Kind of they were already there. And Pierre, I think, is just seeing what people are feeling kind of inchoately and going, that's where people are at right now. I'm going to talk about that. He's just responding to what's in the atmosphere right now.
Yeah. One of the things that the Canada Strong and Free Network, and before that, the Manning Network, have always done is emphasize their place in the small C conservative movement rather than just the capital C Conservative Party. But you look around, Maxime Bernier's not here. I'm not seeing PPC representation. I'm not seeing Ontario Progressive Conservative Party representation. There are some other people that are part of the broader right of center movement that aren't here. I was wondering what you make of that.
I think that's Max's choice. I'm not sure, but I don't know if anyone's being turned away from purchasing a membership.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I think anyone can come here. You just have to register, and so the fact that he's not here, that's his decision, and it's unfortunate actually, because I do think that eventually, I think Maxime and the Conservatives will need to work together at some point, because there are so many overlaps here happening between the two sets of people. Because I meet PPC people who like Pierre, but they don't like Pierre on everything. For example, they didn't like his position on Christine Anderson, but they like him for his support for the Freedom Convoy, for example. I remember his popularity with that crowd really went up at that time. So at some point, I think we're gonna have to see some coming together of the two sides, and hopefully that'll happen.
Well, and I think with anything, the Conservative Party has always advertised itself as a big tent party, but there's always been this tug of war. I mean, social conservatives notably, about where they fit and do they fit in the big blue tent, as it were. And I think that there needs to be the discussion of what are the non-negotiables, what are the core values, the things that everyone needs to be on the same page on, and what are the things that really come down to individual choice. So if you were to give the three non-negotiables for a Conservative Party that should be there, what would they be?
There was a homework assignment and you didn't tell us?
No, it's think of it like a pop quiz. You can't study for it. It has to come from the heart and soul.
Okay, well, the heart and soul says that.
I'll say it doesn't need to be three.
I'll say that there's you have to remember that it's about the regular folks, because you can get caught up in the system and you can get caught up in the big business of it all, but it's got to be about the regular folks. I think that's number one. I think the respect for the taxpayers and finding those efficiencies and honoring that fiscal conservatism, which you can forget about. People do forget about that. That's got to be a major focus there.
I'd say fiscal conservatism, for sure. Small government. I mean, these are challenging things to sort of have in place, even if you're a party with a big tent and all.
Well, and
of
some
that.
of them mean different things to different people too.
Yeah.
I mean, even fiscal conservative, does that mean private healthcare? Does it mean not? Like
in the context of a country that is incredibly still very socialistic, we have socialized medicine, for example. How do you practice minimum government in that context? So this is very challenging. And but yeah, I would pick just as a broad general idea of fiscal conservatism, it would be non-negotiable.
Yeah, and I think beyond that, I mean, my approach would be that it has to be freedom focused. But even that word means so many different things. If you ask CBC, freedom is like a far right racist dog whistle now, as is the Canadian flag. And there's a libertarian contingent to the party, but it's not a libertarian party. So I think that's been the big transition point: is what does freedom look like in the post-COVID era? What does freedom look like? Because I mean, to Pierre Poilievre's credit, that's been his whole MO, which is getting rid of the gatekeepers, more personal freedom, more personal liberty. And it's going to be interesting to see what that translates to in a policy context.
And that's such an important point, because I think maybe the Prime Minister thought when he was talking about Canada being a post-national state that he was reflecting diversity and reflecting the fact that a lot of people come to Canada from different places. But I feel like that's the opposite. And I almost feel like that's almost offensive to those individuals because there's so many people who around the world hear of Canadian values and what that means to them. And they go, I want to be a part of that.
Mhm.
And that I want to go across from the other side of the world and I want to be a part of that project and that nation and join with everybody and all of that. And I feel like if you're not standing up for Canadian values, you're not standing up for all those immigrants who say, we're on that team. Let's rock and roll with this.
Yeah, and I think, there's an aspect of this that needs to be addressed, which is how politics should be bottom up and not top down. And
Yeah.
I think we've seen from the Liberal Party, for example, when the party's central apparatus tries to micromanage the individual beliefs and votes and really to the point of, I think, incredibly strict controls on caucus. Yesterday, when Stephen Harper and Preston Manning were speaking, they really went back to one of the best grassroots experiments in Canadian political history, which is the birth of the Reform Party. And, they talked famously about, passing around the KFC buckets to fill them with money to fund this party. And, I look at this now and I think that, Anthony, obviously we can talk to you about this because getting involved at the local level is not something the right has typically done. Not well. You're running for mayor now in Toronto. And I think we need to see people start reclaiming a lot of these institutions, whether it's school boards, city councils, and really getting involved and driving the agenda as individuals first.
Yeah, and there's that saying that big government makes small citizens. And I think for a while, for a number of years, people thought, okay, it's all covered. The government's got it. The politicians have it. All the senior bureaucrats have it. Fine. But then people realized, well, hold on a second. I've ceded the floor, and what are they doing? And a lot of these people are very experienced and well-natured and fine, and we're getting some good results. But hold on, I want to be a part of that conversation a bit more because I've realized there's stuff happening in my city or stuff happening in my kid's school that I'm not 100% sure about. So people are getting back in the game now. And I do feel like cities, because there's so much just about our daily lives and garbage collection and clean streets and safe streets, value for money on those services, there is an opportunity for someone who has a real fiscal conservative mindset to come in and shake things up and bring them back to those core values because, all politics is local and our local lives end up calling out for fiscal responsibility and responsiveness and really being there for the little guy more than almost any other level of government.
I think the battle is now literally at our doorstep. If you're a parent, you're concerned about what's being taught in the schools. You're concerned about drag shows for kids, drag story time for children. Parents are literally battling this out. And yes, all politics is local, but it's now taken on a different meaning where we're all directly affected by what's happening to us. It's no longer something that's out there and, we'll deal with it at the next elections and that sort of thing. You literally are dealing with these issues day in and day out. And what's ailed the conservative movement all over the world for the longest time has been the lack of grassroots participation in these issues. They've always sort of stayed away from that and ceded that ground to the left. But that's starting to change. It's starting to change in Europe. For example, I think those recent elections, I believe in Denmark, where the farmers protesting against these new agricultural policies there, won in these elections recently, which surprised everybody. So this is starting to change all over the world, and it's happening now in Canada. I would say one of the catalysts of this change was the freedom protests last year, and that I think, the protests are over, but I think the sentiment behind the protests, the idea behind it, freedom, those things are still pretty strong among with people, and I think that's going to have an impact in the coming months and years.
One of the big things that I think is kind of an important issue for us at True North, certainly, and when you mentioned parents' rights, Trudeau Senior, Pierre Trudeau, famously said, government has no place in the bedrooms of a nation. Parents are seeing right now government get involved in their personal decision-making. And I don't just mean about vaccines. I mean about education. I mean about how they raise their children. And government needs to listen to parents. Like I remember in Ontario, would have been the 2018 election, there have been a lot of parents that were not just conservatives that were raising issues with the changes to the sex ed curriculum. And I think the Kathleen Wynne government really did itself a disservice by being so dismissive of these concerns. And you have parents now that are raising issues, whether it's about critical race theory or about some of the gender stuff being taught in schools. And when you activate parents as a voting group, you better get out of the way.
Yeah, for sure. Watch out for those mama bears, certainly. And, but whatever the politics of the parent is, I mean, get involved because it's your community. You're paying for it. It's your environment. And the further there are people leaving the public school system, and there's an expansion of alternative options. And I certainly support people accessing alternative options. But at the same time, that should be an early warning sign to the school system that people are unhappy. So whatever the result or the political bent that's going to happen, I think all parents should feel empowered to get a bit more involved and join the parent-teacher meetings and have their say. Because again, there was a period where I think there weren't that many people involved. Parental involvement kind of dropped off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not a parent, but I'm very concerned about what's happening in our schools. And you know, children are our future and are the future. And I think this is indoctrination. I think this is evil. I think this is beyond the pale, and it should be called out. And I'm glad that parents are, you know, on the front lines of this battle. And you know, and like you said, they've been activated, and there's no uncorking the bottle. You know what I mean.
Yeah.
So,
no, and that's why, and I don't want to dwell too much on the last 3 years, but it has been a bit of a turning point in Canadian politics. And I think one of the real benefits to the government of the last few years is that you had restrictions in place that prevented people from assembling and gathering, and it prevented people from getting under the same roof and talking about how annoyed they were at what was happening. And now that you've removed that and people are gathering, people are assembling, the proliferation of grassroots groups and organizations, some of which may have a few dozen people, but I used to get, you know, maybe a couple of requests to speak a year. And now I'm getting people to say, I've started this group in this town that has 500 people and we've got 400 members and
great.
We'd love to come.
And
there's so many of them. So people are mobilizing.
That's awesome, because one big concern, and I don't think politicians can or even should solve this issue, but is the erosion of civil society. You know that famous saying from a book 20 years ago, the bowling alone thesis, that people just don't do things like bowling leagues anymore, or any community group or getting together. That stuff is not having participation in charitable organizations, volunteerism, faith groups, all of that. The numbers in some corners have been dwindling the past 20 years, and to have a revival of civic life where that is actually the backbone of society, and that's the feeder system for what politicians do, as opposed to the politician reigning supreme. You want all these feedback mechanisms that are ultimately, like I said, the undercurrent of civil society.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree with you. I often get asked this question, Rupa, what is it that I can do? You know, how can I help? You know, when it comes to a certain issue. A lot of people are just really passionate about these issues, and they want to get involved. They want to be able to make a difference. They want to participate in civic life. I know people who are actively considering going into politics at the local level. This would have been unheard of, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, but that's starting to change, and that's very heartening.
Let's turn to how to make a difference. Obviously, the three of us have decided independent media is a huge part of this. This is where I have to put you on the spot, though, Anthony, because you've also decided to some extent that politics might be
I'm kidding.
A part of it. And I sought elected office at one point unsuccessfully, and I think looking back, I'm grateful that things shook out the way they did. But why is independent media the best vehicle? Why is politics the best vehicle? Or is it fruitless to try to view one or the other as being part of the solution?
Well, to our point about, civic life and just get in the game more, I think that's what it is. Get in the game more. And there are less, I'm not trying to steal this term from Pierre, Poilievre, or echo him, but the idea of gatekeepers, it just doesn't exist as much anymore, because in this current online realm, social media realm, things are much more open source, open code, if I can steal that phrase there, in terms of, I think anything is possible for outsider candidates to come in and make their voices heard. Anything is possible for different media to step forward and rise to the fore and generate a big audience if they're just being true to themselves, being true to what the regular folks want, and authentically engaging with people. So like, the world is your oyster, go for it. And whether it's starting a community group, a parent group, a media organization, running for office. I think the sky is the limit for so many people. Anything is possible right now.
To your question about independent media, now I'm part of two great independent media outlets, the Free Press and True North, of course. And it's very exciting, I can tell you. But I also write for the National Post, which is legacy media. And it's I straddle two different worlds here. But I would say that the independent media space is incredibly exciting. We're not afraid to, call things out the way we see them. Today, for example, my podcast deals with the Trudeau government having given out emergency bailout money to Chinese dailies, which are seen as pro-Beijing. Now, this was based on a column I wrote for the National Post, but it's now on True North. And that's the sort of thing that you do not see generally. Typically, you don't see these issues being covered in the legacy media, and that's what makes it very exciting. Increasingly, I find people are turning to outlets like True North. I mean, I get recognized not because of the Free Press or the National Post. I get recognized because of True North, and that's incredible.
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, even when I was flying to Ottawa, the pilot came out to, use the washroom and gave me a bit of a double take. And then when I was getting off the plane, the
was
pilot...
a security check.
Yeah, it might have been. Well, at the time,
so.
I thought it was, and would have continued to think that if he hadn't said at the end, just as I was getting off the plane, thank you for your work. And it's one person, and everyone else on the plane had no idea who I was, but those things are happening more and more,
Yes.
and it's a weird thing for me because
you want the guy flying the plane to like you.
Yeah,
it's the
you really
important
do.
thing.
Yeah,
the passengers, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, haven't helped the CBC reporters that he sees on the flight if he's a fan of ours. But no, it was really important for me to have that because it's like I sort of just transitioned at one point. I don't know when that point was, from a guy that just talked about things because they were of interest to me and important to me, to someone that people listen to for some reason. And I never lose gratitude for the audience because, for us, this is our work. We've chosen to do this. We're paid for it. But for the audience, they're taking a step of courage when they decide to share a True North story for all their teacher friends, or, a rebel story for this group and that group. Like people are taking a step when they say, I'm going to wean myself off of this traditional narrative.
And we're grateful for it.
Yes.
And when they do it, to your point about taking the step, other people then get involved because hey, we're all reasonable people. We have a story to tell. We want to tell your stories, and we're looking to include as many people as possible in what we're talking about here. Broadening the narrative, broadening the tent. So it's nice to see so many people come forward and participate.
Yeah.
No, it's incredibly encouraging, and I'm always just touched by the many messages that I receive, not just from my podcast, but just even here at the conference. People are genuinely grateful. It's extraordinary, actually, because you would think that, I find myself in a weird place. Why are you thanking me for this when I'm not doing anything extraordinary here? I'm just tackling topics which I think are interesting, and just, I'm not afraid to go into these subjects. But yet people are incredibly grateful for what we do. And that's telling. That's telling because that just shows just how, devoid of content, important content, the mainstream media space is. Yeah.
But to go back to the gatekeeper comment, Anthony, there's no permission slip to be a journalist. There's no license to be a journalist. I mean, journalism is what you do more than it's who you are. And I've always really rejected the gatekeeping powers of like the parliamentary press gallery or whatever, because none of us are special. I mean, we have experience and training, but it's like all of us are just asking the right questions and thinking to ask the questions. And to go back to your convoy coverage, I mean, you weren't doing anything radical. You were just going around talking to people, which should have been what everyone else in Canadian media was doing.
Journalism 101.
Yeah. So citizen journalism and independent journalism, they're not the same, but they're very similar. And I think more people need to be asking questions themselves of their leaders, of institutions.
Yeah, look, with the Freedom Convoy protests, I think one of the problems, and I should acknowledge this, the mainstream media, there were journalists from the mainstream media there on the ground, and they really wanted to speak to the truckers and the protesters, but everybody recognized them and they didn't trust them.
Yeah.
And just,
well, it was easy because they had the bodyguards with them. They had
and you go there, with this big camera on your shoulder, and you have like an entourage of people. These are things that make people extremely uncomfortable, and especially if you don't trust a particular journalist because they have a certain slant, you're not going to speak to them. In my case, nobody really knew me. I was just writing a column for the National Post. Nobody had even heard of me, although I'd been doing it for 2 years at that point.
I was a fan of yours before it was cool to be a fan of yours. I just like it noted.
I really appreciate that, and the feeling is mutual. So, and so when I started chatting with people, they'd ask me, "So who do you write for?" And I'd say, "Well, I write for the National Post." And they were like, "Oh, mainstream media." I said, "Yes, but I'm a freelancer. I'm independent." I had to qualify it in that manner.
You have to walk around with your contract. No, I'm freelance. I can be trusted.
More importantly, Andrew and Anthony, I had to gain their trust. I really had to spend time with them and tell them, look, I just want to hear your story. I don't have an agenda here. I'm just here to listen. Why are you here? What's your, what is your ultimate goal? How long do you plan on being here? These were the basic questions. Speak to their kids and just have a conversation that you would have with a friend. And that was my approach for the full 3 weeks that I was there. And eventually people started recognizing me and they got comfortable speaking to me. But that's really as simple. It's as simple as that. And I didn't go to journalism school.
Just as we wind down here, what is it that you're most interested in seeing or most looking forward to in the remainder of the conference?
Well, if I can sort of cheat the question and say hearing Stephen Harper give that address about there being a conservative renaissance in terms of people being much more open to those ideas, and also that the center, as I said earlier, is sort of shifting. The pendulum is moving, and I think he was talking about all of that, and a lot of it talking about the history of the creation of both the reform movement, even things like social credit, things that weren't necessarily conservative, hybrid politics, independent, even some more sort of left-wing politics that you saw in the prairies in decades past, and all of our conversation, I think, has been underpinned by the idea of people getting involved, grassroots involvement. I think that was a real highlight.
And for you, last word.
For me, I was very similar to Anthony's observations. I really like what Stephen Harper had to say, especially on populism. This is a topic that I've worked on quite extensively as well, and I interviewed Preston Manning on this. And populism, it's denigrated in the media as a bad thing. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing.
Well, it is always great to see colleagues in person, especially when we have a decentralized virtual operation. We are going to get back to the conference. We'll have more interviews coming out in the days ahead here. But my thanks to Anthony Furey, Rupa Subramanya, and the whole True North team here. We will talk to you all later. Have a wonderful weekend.